Hi artists, let's talk about some air dry clay. So, you will have your clay in a Ziploc bag. It is key that you keep this Ziploc bag. You want to always put in your clay back into an airtight container every day you finish working with it so it doesn't dry out. You've also been given a toothpick, some tools, a little container of slip. Now some extra things that I think are really useful. Having a cup of water nearby can be really helpful. I also like to put a little bit of something on my work surface so that way cleanup's easy. I like wax paper or parchment paper can work really well. Always think having a towel nearby is really handy as well. Now, let's go over some basics. First off, the clay. This is air dry clay, so it does not need to be fired. So that means that it will get hard just by sitting in the air. You don't have to cook it. Now this clay, you'll notice, does get very messy, so I suggest you make a workspace that is conducive to that. So a place where you can actually get dirty and not worry about it. That's why I like having a little bit of wax paper underneath. Now your hands are also going to get very dirty as well, but remember, clay is just a type of mud. So if your hands are dirty, it washes off. It's just dirt. It is no big deal. Alright, so let's talk about the properties of this clay. This clay is great because it is a higher quality than the air dry clay you might get at the store, like Crayola, Model Magic, things like that. These guys were done with some oven dry clay, actually. They were great, but I'm personally more of a fan of this type. This is more similar to the type that professional ceramic artists use because it is, well, it's just the texture of it. It's really moldable. You can push it back together. You can smooth things out. It's a great one to use. Okay, so you may notice when you first open your bag, if it is really wet, kind of sticky to it, just let it sit in the air for 5-10 minutes. Let it dry out. This type of clay is one that can dry out and be rehydrated as many times as you need to. That does mean that you cannot make any waterproof containers though, unless you put something on it. So if you make a little cup or a bowl, just know you're not going to be drinking anything out of them. They're going to be storage containers. You were also given a little container of slip. Now, slip is going to be our glue. We'll get to that a bit later. You'll notice it's kind of a messy, goopy, muddy mess on the inside. Just leave that be. We'll talk about that later. Let's talk a little bit about the tools you got and their uses. Now, each of you got 2 different wooden tools and a toothpick. They were variety packs, so no 2 of you have the same, but they're all very useful. A couple main things you want to look at when it comes to your tools. If there is a sharp side, now I say sharp relatively easily, they're not actually sharp, right? They're not knives. These can be great for cutting out areas. I recommend doing multiple swipes. Don't try to cut it through the first time. If you try cutting through once the first time, it kind of smushes your design a little bit, but they can be great for cutting. They can be also really great for pressing in designs or even kind of pressing in little things like that or carving with them. If you have a more rounded edge, these can be great for smoothing and rounding out areas, maybe pressing in a full little sphere. This one has rounded and a flat side to it. So there's all different things you can use these for. Toothpicks, I like them best for slipping and scoring, so we can scratch it up to score. You could also cut things with them. I'm not the biggest fan about carving designs with a toothpick, because as you can see, a lot of these little, we call them burrs, end up sticking up. That happened in a lot of the pieces here. Burrs are these little bits of clay that get pulled up when you cut into it. The clay needs somewhere to go when you cut into it, and they stick up. They're not the nicest looking things, so I always like to come back and smooth over the top. Whenever I'm using a toothpick, if I'm trying to carve a design, I never go straight up and down. Instead, I want to kind of go at an angle and I press instead of carve. Pressing tends to leave a smoother line. I like the bigger tools as well. They're going to help you get those smoother edges. So again, just comparing straight up and down, pressing and pulling on its side, or some of those larger tools. Now, none of them are perfect. They all leave little bumps, but you can see this one is a very thin line, lots of those little burrs. So I don't like using toothpicks for carving. Instead, use something a little bit bigger. Even a pencil that's dull is great for clay. Even just an old pen. Anything you can use to carve, press, stamp in designs into clay can be really, really useful. Try out your different tools, see how they work best for you. If you notice that your clay gets too dry, it's starting to crack as you try to squish it. See these little cracks forming? You need to rehydrate your clay. Really simple. It gets a little messy, but it's really simple. Take a little bit of water, put it on your hands, put it on the clay. Not a lot, don't need a huge amount. And I want to knead that water into the clay. So I kind of smush, break it apart. Smush, break it apart. It's going to be slimy at first. It's going to be messy, but you want to work that water into the clay. It's like you're mixing it in. Smush, break apart. Smush, break it apart. This is working that clay in. It's going to be really messy at first, but as you work it in, as you knead that water in, it'll start forming back together because that water is being absorbed by the clay. See how it's not quite so smushy, sticky anymore? There you go. And boom, all of a sudden we have nice soft clay ready to work with again. Okay, so again, if it's too dry, just add a little water, smush, break it apart, smush, break it apart. Knead that water in. If your clay is too wet, like mine's a little sticky right now, smush it so it's a bit thinner. That'll give us more surface area, and let it sit out. Half hour or so, and it'll be a lot drier. Could even be faster than that. So let's talk about how you need to pack away your clay at the end of the day or the period, whenever you're working on your clay. Whenever you're ready to stop for the day, here's what you need to do. We need to make sure that this clay stays wet overnight, so that way when we come back to it the next day, we're still able to work with it. So if it gets too dry, we can't do anything to it. So here are some tricks. First and foremost, use that Ziploc bag. Put it into the bag. Get out as much air as you can. Seal it up tight. Make sure that seal is good. If your clay was still fairly wet, this should keep it wet for you overnight. Now, if you notice your clay starts to get a little dry when you're working with it each day, a little trick, you could take a little piece of paper towel, maybe just like a little chunk like this. Get it a little bit wet. Okay, and I'm not talking soaking wet. I can't wring this out and get any water, but it's nicely moist. If I just take this and I put it on and around my clay piece and then into the bag, this moisture will soak into that clay overnight and help keep it a little bit wetter. Now you gotta be careful. If you make this paper towel too wet, the next day when you open it up, it's just gonna be a mushy mess. So really get used to seeing what works best for your clay. You might even just take a little wet towel and put it in the bag, not even touching your clay, just in the same bag. That will keep moisture in the bag to keep your clay a little bit wetter. That can be a great trick as well. Just make sure your bag is sealed so that way your clay does not dry out overnight. At the end of the day, you're definitely going to be messy. Clay is not a clean thing to use. So make sure you have a place you can go and wash up at. As the clay dries on your hand, it starts to flake off. So you can see the little flakes and stuff coming off here. Try to keep that in a contained area. Try not to let it get onto the floor. It is dirt, it is mud. It will make a mess. It's not going to stain, but your family's not going to be very happy about it. That's why I like having something to work on. So at the end of the day, I can just kind of scoop everything together and brush it into the garbage can. But make sure you go wash your hands nicely, maybe even rinse off your tools at the end of each day, just to keep your work area clean.